Kalam Yaori with a dialogue coming to life in Beijing. In Cambodia, China has persuaded ASEAN to restrict their territorial disputes to the regional framework of 10+1, despite Manila's strong reluctance. The hard-won consensus of ASEAN means that most member states do not want to embarrass China, their biggest trading partner, by internationalizing the South China Sea issues. China has agreed to negotiate the proposed binding code of conduct about the maritime spat. Will the U.S. and Japan be rejected in the bickering in the U.S. pivot to Asia? At the same time, ROK President Lee Myung-bak and Chinese Premier Wen Jiabao have pledged to increase the bilateral trade and to promote security mutual trust in an effort to contain the rise of Japanese right-wing forces. ASEAN vows to forge a single market by the end of 2015. Can regional integration finally survive diversity? Given tariff and non-tariff barriers, problems of free investment and poor infrastructure, is it possible to set up a vast free trade area in the region to avoid overlapping?
我抱着增进互信、推动合作的真诚愿望而来。
How should China respond to the unified call by Southeast Asian nations to resume talks on a binding code of conduct?
This should not be a stumbling block between China-ASEAN relations.
That we are not going to allow the issue to cloud or to affect other pursuits that we are doing together here.
And few of U.S. allies or friends in Asia want to antagonize their biggest trading partner of China. How do we look at the China complex for U.S. policymakers at the East Asia Summit? Welcome back. Despite the media coverage, I'm not sure whether a consensus has indeed been set up between China and ASEAN 10 member states with regard to the maritime spat in the South China Sea. What's your knowledge?
I think it depends on what's the nature of the negotiation. Negotiation to the settlement or start negotiation. I think for China, in the perspective of China, negotiate in the framework of the ASEAN +1. It's okay, acceptable. Why not? So you have the framework, we can talk. But the negotiation to make the decision, I think it's a long way to go.
When Cambodian Prime Minister Hun Sen announced the consensus, so to speak, Filipino President Aquino III disrupted his comments by saying there's no such a thing like a consensus among the 10 member states. That somehow showcased the disputes.
Well, I think that there's probably still a dispute ongoing. I think what they wanted to do is to set this issue aside during the time of the ASEAN summit itself so they could get to other issues and discuss those. Not even trying, I don't think, to settle this forever. I think they'll set it aside and get back to it after the summit is over.
But Mark, what do you think of China's efforts to tone down the disputes, to pave the way for stabilizing the economic relationship so that China's image will not be undermined?
Well, I think that's wise to do that. I think communication is the key to very many diplomatic breakthroughs. And so the more that countries talk to each other bilaterally and multilaterally in some of these ASEAN-type settings, the better off they are.
Hailing, what do you think of his analysis?
Actually, I think if you want to pave the way, you also need to hear the other voice. You know, you just don't, for the China, it's not possible to, okay, the 10+1 or any 10 among the ASEANs know any voice on the South China Sea issue.
What do you mean by listening to other voices? Do the other voices include the voice of Japan and that of the U.S.?
Of course. You should listen. You hear the voice.
In that case, we're going to internationalize the maritime dispute.
Internationalize means that if you hear the
bottom line of China is that we would not internationalize.
Internationalize means do not go through settle the problem by the international framework. That means we don't hear from them. That's a huge difference.
There is a game of words. What do you think?
No, I think you can cycle this up and get everybody excited about it. I think you're better off keeping it calm and simple and private. A lot of this discussions ought to be done privately, in private settings, so closed doors, and not in public.
That's the key point. You know, if you want to lower down their voice, you just put your fingers and shut up. It's not. You should hear, and then you should respond, and then the voice could cool down. It's not possible, okay, from the very beginning, I don't want to hear from you. No, it's not. I don't think it's an appropriate attitude.
Mr. Morgenstern, author of Politics in Nations, said that the general public should not be involved in the formulation of the foreign policies. Otherwise, the rise of nationalism threatens to derail any healthy diplomatic negotiations. What do you think of his point and concerns?
Well, I think it's wise that the general public, at least in America, is easily swayed and can be swayed to do certain things and then swayed back to do other things. I think having diplomats, reasoned and seasoned diplomats in the U.S. and other countries, it's wise to have them at the helm and not to let the public...
Gentlemen, we have to leave you there for the moment. Let's cross over to Mr. Tang Xiumon, a senior research fellow with the Institute of Strategic and International Studies in Kuala Lumpur. Hello.
Good evening, Mr. Yang.
Good evening. Tell us the perspective of ASEAN about the so-called consensus regarding, the maritime disputes between China and ASEAN 10 member states.
Well, for ASEAN, the consensus, speaking in one voice is very important because ASEAN unity and ASEAN centrality goes hand in hand. So in this regard, it is important for ASEAN to stick together, but at the same time, we should open the door for differences of opinion and to talk among ourselves and also with China to resolve the differences in the South China Sea.
Well, regional regional unity is so important. It means to speak with one voice. However, we know that ASEAN is actually composed of the rich poor and the poor poor. Sorry, the rich five and the poor five. Yes. I'm a little bit confused about the complexity of Asian politics. Is it easy for the 10 member states of ASEAN to form their single voice?
No, I don't think so. Actually, diversity is a nature, and actually is also the advantages of the ASEAN. Only they speak in different language and express the common willing, and then they can reach some achievement. But if you force them to formulate as only one voice, I don't think this voice will be strong enough. Actually, it will fulfill a lot of the compromise, and then it's totally meaningless.
Obviously, a majority of ASEAN member states do not want to be held hostage by the demands of just a handful of the claimants within this regional framework. What do you think of their, grievances?
I don't mean to change the subject, but I think that the whole issue of the territorial disputes in the South China Sea is a little bit like the tail wagging the dog. I think the big story coming out of the ASEAN summit is the regional economic cooperation that they have agreed to. I mean, I think we could talk about agreements. That's one I think is going to have a lot more long-term impact in the region than the territorial disputes.
Oh, I agree.
Right. Let me get back to Mr. Tang Xiumon. Irrespective of the increasingly integrated economies of this region, I mean, I'm talking about China and ASEAN 10, fires of ultra-nationalism is on the rise and can be easily stoked. How do you perceive the ultra-nationalism well across the regional spectrum here?
Well, ultra-nationalism is extremely dangerous because it can get out of hand. One day it can be directed at one country, the next day it can be directed at another country, and it can be directed internally as well. I agree with my colleagues that in high diplomacy there's some degree of sensitivity, and sometimes it is best left to professionals and those with informed information, and that too we cannot be foolproof of not making mistakes. But if we let everything play out in the open and ultra-nationalism takes its course, it literally binds the hands of the statesmen and the diplomats from making concessions, from making agreements. So ultra-nationalism is extremely dangerous, and it should not be conflated with patriotism. Patriotism is love for one's country, and that should be encouraged. However, an extreme variant of it that is uncompromising, that is aggressive, is dangerous for not only just China, not just Malaysia, but for all countries in the region.
What do you think of the local media response to the anti-Chinese riots that occurred in Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines?
Well, there have been some movements, to be honest, but in a relative sense, it has not been that widespread. But this is a question that I think the Chinese policymakers and the Chinese statesmen should look at it carefully to ask the question, why are there demonstrations? Is it a misperception on what China did and China's perceived aggressiveness in the South China Sea on other issues? This is a matter that needs to be investigated, needs to be looked at carefully to make sure that the good relations between China and Southeast Asian states continue to prosper in the future.
Hailin, what do you think of his advice that we should look at the demonstrations in those Southeast Asian nations very carefully?
Of course, we should look at it, and we should admit there is some anti-China feeling. But that's not, the question is the cost you have to pay if you want to ensure your maritime security. You can't just, in the first hand, you maintain a very close economic cooperation with the ASEAN partners. And secondly, you also can ensure your maritime safety without any resistance. It's not possible, so make the choice. You have to pay, it's natural.
Well, China obviously feels divided about, having closer economic collaboration with our neighboring countries in Southeast Asia and the umbrella of security that those countries seek from the U.S.
Right.
Mark, what's your take?
Well, I think you maybe wanted to talk a little bit about the U.S. pivot towards Asia.
Exactly. What do you think of the implications of a pivot to Asia? Is it against China?
No, the whole pivot to Asia, I think, has been overblown. I think people have talked about that too much and have read too much into that. The pivot toward Asia is more of an incremental change than it is a huge new wave of U.S. interest in Asia. The U.S. has been interested in Asia and has been in Asia for years. It's not anything new. It's an incremental change, shift away from Europe, away from the Middle East, towards Asia, where we see a lot of economic growth and opportunity and some security issues as well.
I'd like to have comments in our crossover from Mr. Tang Xiumeng. Hello, Mr. Tang. Do you think you have read too much into the U.S. pivot to Asia? This American shift in the policy and the strategy may have been held hostage by the one-sided desire from some of the countries in ASEAN.
Well, I beg to differ. I think we should read more into the U.S. pivot policy. Whenever a great power shifts, extra 10% of its military assets to the region, I think the region should seriously contemplate the impact on regional security. It may have a positive effect, it may have a negative impact. The jury is still out, but nevertheless, ask us not to read too much into it. I don't think that is something that the regional state should be doing. We should be reading into what US is doing, what China is doing, what Japan is doing, what Australia is doing, what everybody is doing, because we need to do a serious reflection on regional security. Is there a threat?
Mr. Tang, we understand the quiet happiness of some of the ASEAN member states about the return to Asia by the U.S. But Mr. Ye Hailin,
yes.
Do you think China is afraid of a pivot to Asia?
I think we should pay more attention on what's the purpose of the President Obama's visit to Bangkok. He wants to sell the TPP. He didn't want to only call for the Thailand and another ASEAN country to pick up the side with America and do not make the choice on China. He want to come here. He came here to sell what he want to sell. He want to enlarge his influence.
To sell what he wants to sell.
Yeah, of course.
To create
the
jobs.
TPP. Yeah, of course. The TPP. TPP is not only an economy tool to boost their own economy. It's also a close linkage between ASEAN and the U.S. Actually, this is the key point. Actually, I really doubt it's only one purpose of the President Obama to pay the Thailand or pay the whole ASEAN. It's just want to find the flame between the for the relation between the China and the ASEAN. It's not. At least maybe there's a purpose, but that definitely not the only one.
What do you think of his argument about the multiple purposes of President Obama's first overseas mission after he won the re-election?
Well, I think it's significant that he did choose to come to Asia, his first visit after the election.
But don't you think his visit to Myanmar is a little bit too early? Because among the 300 or so prisoners released, none are on the list of Amnesty International. Therefore, they argue that President Obama, please do not reward the military junta too early.
Well, I've heard that argument over and over that it's too early, they're rewarding the regime too soon. I don't want to be critical of the president, so I don't think, I think he's acting appropriately in this case. But what I have heard, I've heard people talk about the pivot toward Asia as the U.S. Seeking to create a NATO-type network of alliances throughout Asia to isolate China or to contain China. And I don't think that's the case at all. I mean, this is
Most
a totally
Americans I
different
interview
situation.
disagree, but I'll have to leave you there for the moment. You are watching Dialogue with Mr. Ye Hailin and Mr. Mark Morrison from the Foreign Affairs University of China. He's a visiting scholar from the U.S. So we'll be back in a few minutes. Don't go away. Vast majority of Asian states welcome the presence of the U.S. military, but China, by contrast, may be the loneliest rising power in the living memory of most who follow the developments of China in recent years. Do you think China actually has many genuine or reliable allies in the region, other than Myanmar?
If you really rise up, you will have. But in this process, of course, you will rise alone. Is there any country, rising up country, who rising up with a lot of friends? See the history, there's no. Even American, 200 years ago.
But does it mean we rise rapidly at the cost of traditional relationships with the neighboring countries or with the established power of the U.S.?
Of course, there's something we really need to working on this. Do not sabotage your traditional relation. But doesn't mean you rising up means you gain a lot of friends as much as you can. Actually, it's a consequence. It's not only something you're symbolic to show you have a lot of friends means you are rising up.
Mark, this does not mean an endorsement of a rising power, but it does mean a process that is well underway about reconfiguration between and among major powers in this region, right?
Exactly. Everybody recognizes that China is a rising power, and it's the second largest economy in the world. And it has an economic relationship with many countries in the world, and every country, virtually every country in the region. So as China rises in its influence and power, then obviously the security relationships are going to have changed too. And as China increases its military spending, creates, builds more and more military equipment. I just read the China Daily today that China looks to be interested in buying and building more aircraft carriers. Which is an interesting move.
Well, let me talk to Professor Dr. Tang Siu-Mom with the Institute of Strategic and International Studies in Kuala Lumpur. Hello.
Yes, Mr. Yang.
Some of the analysts in the U.S. describe Thailand, Myanmar, and Cambodia as three naughty boys in ASEAN, and they deserve extra attention from the U.S. government because these three countries have developed a very close economic relationship with China. Therefore, the U.S. got to prioritize its new relationship with these three players in this region. I'd like to have your comment.
I hope that's not true because I don't think our ASEAN colleagues would take too kindly at being characterized as naughty boys. But I would see President Obama's visit to these three countries differently in the sense that in the previous years, President Obama has visited Indonesia, Singapore, and a few other countries. So it is only logical that President Obama spends his time strategically and wisely to visit other countries which he has not as a sitting president. So I don't think there's any specific purpose other than Myanmar. Maybe perhaps that is to give some level of support, of encouragement for the ongoing reform process. But I don't think we should read too much into it, to paraphrase one of our colleagues on the panel today. And we certainly welcome President Obama as we welcome the Chinese president, the Japanese prime minister, any of the statesmen around the world that visits us. They can expect a red carpet and a warm welcome because ASEAN is an open and it's an open region.
Mr. Qin Gang, spokesperson of the Chinese Foreign Ministry, tries to tone down the territorial disputes between ASEAN and China by saying this is not a stumbling block between the two sides. Now, at the same time, what do you think of the apparent attempt by Japan and the U.S. to get involved so that we won't enjoy the quietness that we used to enjoy in the South China Sea. What do you think of the possibility that the consensus between China and ASEAN 10 is likely to alienate the US and Japan?
Sorry, was that question directed?
The question is, obviously, China and ASEAN are joining hands to look for a consensus, meaning to restrict their negotiations about the maritime spat to the regional framework of 10+1. Does that mean it will be done at the cost of the involvement by US and Japan? Obviously, China wants to reject the influence from the US and Japan, because this is only the business between ASEAN and China. We don't want to internationalize this issue, do we?
I don't think that is an approach that ASEAN will welcome and ASEAN would take, because yes, we do want to engage and we have good relations with China, but at the same time we will want to have good relations with America, with the EU, with Australia, with other countries. We don't see our relations with other countries as a zero-sum. At certain sector, our relations will be much better. Take
excuse me, Mr. Tang, excuse me, can you clarify your views about setting up a consensus between China and ASEAN? It means any negotiations about the maritime spat should be only confined to 10+1. Or do you think most ASEAN members want to involve the US and Japan and even Australia? Please clarify. Thank you.
There is some talk among, at least at the tractor community, that perhaps any agreement between ASEAN and China, once it is concluded, there is a possibility to actually broaden it at a later stage to include other countries. And I personally see that as positive, because in the sense that we will have a level playing field. Any countries that have interactions with the region will have to abide by the same rules. That is a level playing field for everyone. But at this particular point in time, any negotiations, any discussions has to be strictly between ASEAN and China. Because of the issues concerned, it is our issues. It should not and does not involve other extra-regional actors.
What do you think of his words, trying to maintain a balance between China and other major powers?
I think it's understandable for us in the perspective of ASEAN. Actually, just like our friends mentioned, if you want to negotiate something very seriously, you have to make the negotiate with the one who involved this business, not extra players. But if you want to share the opinion, of course, any friend you can talk. So that means, basically, my understanding is ASEAN would like to negotiate with China bilaterally between the ASEAN and China, but they would like to talk about the issue multilateral. It's understandable. I think China will feel okay for this, unless this negotiation between expand into a multilateral participant and a roundtable discussion. It won't happen.
Mr. Morrison,
Yes.
why do you think China has tried very hard not to internationalize the issue of South China Sea territorial disputes? Why do you think China considers it a success not to put the issue of our maritime spat on the table for the upcoming East Asia Summit?
Well, I think it's a distraction, actually, because I think there are, like I said before, I think there are more important issues to discuss at the summit than this territorial dispute. And so I think that's one of the reasons. From the U.S. perspective, I think it's important to understand that the U.S. doesn't have a role to play in this. At this point, there could be a role to play as a mediator, but right now I don't think we want to get involved in it. We have strong relations with China, we have strong relations with Japan, with the Philippines, a growing relationship with Vietnam, with Thailand, with Malaysia. But we see it as a regional issue that ought to be solved regionally, and that we will stay back and watch it happen. We don't want to be pulled into it at this point, I don't think.
The U.S. has 5 Cold War type military security treaties with our neighboring countries in Asia. What do you think of the ambiguity of the U.S. position towards the territorial disputes, either in the East China Sea or in the South China Sea, in this context?
Keep them flexible is America's interest. Actually, do not force another people pick up side, because nobody can have the fully confidence that American will force some ASEAN country to pick side, and this country will definitely pick side of America. Nobody can guarantee. So only remain some flexible approach is all country, all players' interest. So nobody would like to force another one against the war,
Mark,
and then there's
Mark,
no way
is it true that the U.S. is quite divided between your attempt to engage China and your efforts to contain China? Because most of those useful partners that you might employ in alienating China, in containing and stifling the rest of China, turn out to be our business partners. I mean, China is their biggest trading partners.
Right.
So any attempt to alienate China would be very expensive.
Yeah.
I would definitely be confronted with a strong reluctance from your partners.
Exactly. The U.S. interests in Asia, and China in particular, are economic primarily. And so we want to make sure that that relationship is strong and growing, and it's fair.
Secretary Clinton said in Singapore that the strength of the U.S. diplomacy comes from its economic dynamics. Therefore, she also pointed out that those who flex economic muscles also rise very fast and could exercise global influence. I'm not sure if she was referring to China, but what do you think of this top concern of Obama to tackle the issue of a fiscal cliff?
Well, that's dominating the U.S. agenda back home right now. In the U.S. is the fiscal cliff and economics, domestic economics. But I think trade and jobs leaving the U.S. going overseas, those are issues that are very high profile and very hot button issues in the U.S. And so that's top on our list. We don't want to do anything that will diminish that kind of economic relationship and economic progress that we're making. And these security issues, as important as they may be to the players in the region, for the U.S., I don't think that rises to the point where it overshadows the economic interest that we have in China and in Asia.
But do you think the overseas trip by President Obama is going to help create jobs back at home?
If he succeed, if the Thailand make the promise that you will join the TPP on the condition of the United States, probably. But TPP is a high standard for a lot of the member countries. It's not easy to go in.
Last Friday, the lower house of the Japanese parliament was dissolved in the hope of, calling on an early election. But at the same time, some of the strong contenders in the race say they have to take a second look at the TPP. They don't want to be involved in the TPP. What do you think of the Japanese reluctance?
Well, I think Japan has a lot of things to worry about internally, and so they got to look at first things first. And I think the elections is going to be something that's going to overshadow a lot of the other things that are going on, and they just need to get their house in order first before they can move forward.
Thank you very much. With that, we come to the end of this edition of Dialogue. Thank you for being with us. I'll see you next time, but bye for now. China and ASEAN 10 member states with regard to the maritime spat in the South China Sea. What's your knowledge?
I think it depends on what's the nature of the negotiation. Negotiation to the settlement or start negotiation. I think for China, in the perspective of China, negotiate in the framework of the ASEAN +1. It's okay, acceptable. Why not? You have the framework, we can talk. But negotiating to make the decision, I think it's a long way to go.
When Cambodian Prime Minister Hun Sen announced the consensus, so to speak, Filipino President Aquino III disrupted his comments by saying there's no such a thing like a consensus among the 10 member states. That somehow showcased the disputes.
Well, I think that there's probably still a dispute ongoing. I think what they wanted to do is to set this issue aside during the time of the ASEAN summit itself so they could get to other issues and discuss those. Not even trying, I don't think, to settle this forever. I think they'll set it aside and get back to it after the summit is over.
But Mark, what do you think of China's efforts to tone down the disputes, to pave the way for stabilizing the economic relationship so that China's image would not be undermined?
Well, I think that's wise to do that. I think communication is the key to very many diplomatic breakthroughs. And so the more that countries talk to each other bilaterally and multilaterally in some of these ASEAN-type settings, the better off they are.
Hailing, what do you think of his analysis?
Actually, I think if you want to pave the way, you also need to hear the other voice. You know, you just don't, for the China, it's not possible to, okay, the 10 plus 1 or any 10 among the ASEANs know any voice on the South China Sea issue.
What do you mean by listening to other voices? Do the other voices include the voice of Japan and that of the U.S.?
Of course, you should listen. You hear the voice.
In that case, we're gonna internationalize the maritime.
Internationalize means that if you hear the
bottom line of
voice,
China is that we would not internationalize.
Internationalize means do not go through settle the problem by the international framework. That means we don't hear from them.
Can regional integration finally survive diversity? Given tariff and non-tariff barriers, problems of free investment and poor infrastructure, is it possible to set up a vast free trade area in the region to avoid overlapping?
我抱着增进互信、推动合作的真诚愿望而来。
How should China respond to the unified call by Southeast Asian nations to resume talks on a binding code of conduct?
This should not be a stumbling block between China-ASEAN relations.
That we are not going to allow the issue to cloud or to affect other pursuits that we are doing together here.
And few of U.S. allies or friends in Asia want to antagonize their biggest trading partner of China. How do we look at the China complex for U.S. policymakers at the East Asia Summit? Welcome back. Despite the media coverage, I'm not sure whether a consensus has indeed been set up between China. I'm Yaori with a dialogue coming to you live from Beijing. In Cambodia, China has persuaded ASEAN to restrict their territorial disputes to the regional framework of 10+1, despite Manila's strong reluctance. The hard-won consensus of ASEAN means that most member states do not want to embarrass China, their biggest trading partner, by internationalizing the South China Sea issues. China has agreed to negotiate the proposed binding code of conduct about the maritime spat. Will the U.S. and Japan be rejected in the bickering in the U.S. pivot to Asia? At the same time, our key President Lee Myung-bak and Chinese Premier Wen Jiabao have pledged to increase the bilateral trade and to promote security mutual trust in an effort to contain the rise of Japanese right-wing forces. ASEAN vows to forge a single market by the end of 2015.
Huge difference.
There is a game of words. What do you think?
No, I think you can cycle this up and get everybody excited about it. I think you're better off keeping it calm and simple and private. A lot of this discussions ought to be done privately, in private settings, so closed doors, and not in public.
That's the key point. You know, if you want to lower down their voice, you just put your fingers and shut up. It's not. You should hear, and then you should respond, and then the voice could cool down. It's not possible, okay, from the very beginning, I don't want to hear from you. No, it's not. I don't think it's an appropriate attitude.
Mr. Morgenstern, author of Politics in Nations, said that the general public should not be involved in the formulation of the foreign policies. Otherwise, the rise of nationalism threatens to derail any healthy diplomatic negotiations. What do you think of his point and concerns?
Well, I think it's wise that the general public, at least in America, is easily swayed and can be swayed to do certain things and then swayed back to do other things. I think having diplomats, reasoned and seasoned diplomats in the